What would you do if you witnessed an animal suffering right before your eyes? Would you turn away, telling yourself it's not your problem? Or would you stop, knowing that your action might be the only thing standing between life and death? Prepare yourself for a story of incredible resilience, unexpected connection, and a miracle that unfolded when one person refused to look the other way. The January air in rural Tennessee cut like a knife, temperatures plummeting well below freezing as night approached in the small community of Oak Ridge. Most residents had retreated to the warmth of their homes, thermostats turned up, curtains drawn against the bitter cold that transformed breath into crystalline clouds and froze exposed skin within minutes. It was weather that demanded shelter, that punished any creature left exposed to its merciless grip. Sarah Lawson wasn't supposed to be on Meadow Creek Road that evening, her usual route home blocked by a fallen tree that forced her to detour through this less traveled part of the county. Her old Subaru's heater worked overtime, barely keeping pace with the frigid air as she navigated the unfamiliar turns, eager to get home to her apartment after a 12-hour shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse in the intensive care unit. The headlights of her car swept across the abandoned property as she rounded the bend. An old farmhouse, windows boarded up, yard overgrown with winter-dead weeds, a chain-link fence surrounding what had once been a side yard, now laden with debris and discarded furniture. Sarah might have driven past without a second glance, another forgotten property in a county full of them, if not for the flash of movement that caught her peripheral vision. A dark shape huddled against the fence line. "What the hell?" Sarah muttered, slowing her car instinctively, squinting through the windshield into the gathering darkness. Something about the movement seemed wrong, deliberate yet restricted, and before she could rationalize continuing her journey, she was pulling onto the gravel shoulder, hazard lights blinking a rhythmic warning to any cars that might follow. She sat for a moment, engine idling, debating the wisdom of investigating a deserted property at dusk in an unfamiliar area. The shape moved again, and this time there was no mistaking it. An animal large enough to be a dog, shifting position but not moving away from the fence line, despite the approaching vehicle and flashing lights that would normally send a stray running. Sarah reached for the flashlight she kept in her glove compartment, a habit from years of night shifts and rural driving, and zipped her coat up to her chin, bracing herself for the blast of cold that would greet her when she opened the car door. The temperature hit her like a physical blow, cold air burning her lungs as she picked her way carefully across the uneven ground toward the fence, the beam of her flashlight bobbing ahead of her. "Hello?" she called out, feeling slightly foolish. If it was an animal, it wouldn't respond, and if it was a person, they might not be someone she wanted to encounter. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" As Sarah drew closer, the scene illuminated by her flashlight beam turned her blood to ice, colder than the winter air. It was indeed a dog, a large one with a coat that might once have been golden but was now matted with dirt, and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The animal was secured to the fence by a heavy chain wrapped multiple times around its neck, the links cutting into flesh raw from what must have been desperate attempts to break free. The dog raised its head at Sarah's approach, eyes reflecting the flashlight beam with an eerie yellow glow, but it made no sound, no bark of warning or whimper of fear, just a steady, silent gaze that seemed to hold more weariness than hope. The lack of reaction was perhaps more disturbing than any aggression would have been, suggesting a resignation that came only from prolonged suffering, from repeatedly watching potential saviors drive past without stopping. Sarah's medical training kicked in, her assessment clinical despite the emotion rising in her throat, severe emaciation with ribs and hip bones clearly visible even through the matted fur, signs of dehydration evident in the dog's sunken eyes, open wounds on its neck where the chain had rubbed the skin raw, and what appeared to be infected sores on its hindquarters. The physical condition alone told a story of prolonged neglect, but it was the pile of snow-covered waste around the dog that confirmed the horror. This animal had been chained in this spot for weeks, possibly longer. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, crouching down but keeping a cautious distance, aware that even the gentlest animal could become unpredictable when injured and trapped. "What happened to you?" The dog made no move toward her, either too weak or too wary, but those eyes remained fixed on her face, watching, waiting, perhaps judging whether this human would be like the ones who had left it here to die, altogether different. There was a bowl overturned in the frozen mud beside the dog, bone dry and covered in a layer of frost that suggested no one had filled it in days, perhaps weeks. No shelter had been provided. No doghouse, no tarp, not even a cardboard box to offer minimal protection from the elements that would have already killed a less resilient animal. It was abuse through abandonment, a slow death sentence carried out by exposure, starvation, and neglect. Sarah's mind raced through options. Animal control would be closed at this hour, and the local shelter was notoriously overcrowded and understaffed, unlikely to send someone out until morning, by which time the dog might not survive another night of sub-freezing temperatures. The police might respond, but in this rural county with limited resources, a chained dog would hardly register as a priority against more pressing human emergencies. "I'm going to help you," Sarah said softly, the decision crystallizing as she spoke the words aloud. Her shift was over. No one was waiting for her at home except her elderly cat. And while she had no experience with abused dogs, she had something perhaps more valuable: medical knowledge and a heart that refused to leave a suffering creature to die alone in the cold. "I need to get some things from my car. I'll be right back. I promise." The contents of Sarah's car became an impromptu rescue kit: a blanket kept for emergencies, bottled water, the remains of her lunch sandwich, and a pair of trauma shears from her medical bag that might cut through the dog's chain if the lock proved too difficult. Her hands trembled, partly from the cold, but mostly from a surging adrenaline that sharpened her senses even as it amplified her awareness of all the ways this rescue attempt could go wrong. Approaching the dog a second time, Sarah maintained a running monologue in a soft, even voice, explaining each movement before she made it, a technique she'd learned in the ICU, where even unconscious patients sometimes responded to verbal cues. "I'm going to give you some water now," she said, kneeling in the frozen mud at a safe distance, pouring some of her bottled water into the overturned bowl she'd righted. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog watched her with that same unsettling intensity, making no move toward the water despite what must have been desperate thirst. Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that the animal had likely been conditioned to expect punishment for any movement, trained by cruelty to remain exactly where it had been placed, regardless of need or discomfort. "It's okay," she repeated, pushing the bowl closer with cautious movements. "You can drink." Only when Sarah retreated several steps did the dog finally extend its neck as far as the chain would allow, lapping at the water with a dry, cracked tongue that spoke of severe dehydration. Sarah used this moment to examine the restraint more closely, a heavy-duty chain secured with a combination padlock to a rusted collar that had become embedded in the dog's neck in places, the metal and flesh fused by infection and restricted blood flow. The sight made bile rise in Sarah's throat, anger flaring hot against the January cold. This wasn't neglect, but deliberate cruelty, a living creature reduced to a possession and then discarded when it became inconvenient. The dog finished the water quickly, looking up at her with what Sarah wanted to believe was gratitude, but might simply have been continued wariness, a creature too long betrayed by humans to trust a single act of kindness. "I need to check your collar," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her professional detachment. "I won't hurt you, but I need to see if I can get you free." She approached slowly, holding out her hand palm down for the dog to sniff, a gesture half remembered from childhood interactions with friendly pets, though she knew this situation was drastically different. To her surprise, the dog made no aggressive move as she drew closer, instead lowering its head slightly, a submission that spoke of either extraordinary trust or, more likely, a spirit broken by prolonged abuse. Up close, the dog's condition was even worse than she had initially assessed, patches of fur missing entirely, revealing skin ravaged by frostbite and parasites, ribs like a xylophone beneath her gentle touch, and a racing heart that suggested the early stages of shock. Sarah's examination of the collar confirmed her fears. The padlock was rusted shut, unlikely to yield to any tool she had available, and attempting to cut through the chain with her trauma shears would be futile. The collar itself had become a medical emergency, the metal embedded deeply enough in places that removing it improperly could damage vital blood vessels or tracheal tissue, potentially killing the dog in the process of trying to save it. "We need professional help," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to the dog, who had begun to shiver violently as the temperature continued to drop. Night had fully descended now, the only illumination coming from her flashlight and the distant glow of her car's hazard lights, making the abandoned property seem even more desolate, a forgotten corner of the world where suffering went unwitnessed and unrelieved. Sarah retrieved her phone, sending up a silent prayer for reception in this rural area as she dialed the emergency veterinary clinic in Knoxville, nearly an hour's drive, but the only 24-hour animal hospital she knew of. The call connected, breaking up slightly but clear enough for Sarah to explain the situation in the urgent but precise language of a medical professional, emphasizing the embedded collar, the signs of shock, and the dog's critical condition. "Ma'am, this sounds like a case for animal control," the receptionist said, her voice sympathetic but firm. "We can certainly provide treatment once the dog is brought in, but we don't have staff available to perform field rescues, especially that far out of county. If you can transport the animal yourself, we can meet you at the clinic, but..." "The collar is embedded in the dog's neck," Sarah interrupted, frustration edging her voice. "Moving him without proper equipment could kill him. Isn't there some kind of emergency response team? A veterinarian who makes house calls? Anything?" The silence on the other end of the line answered her question before the receptionist's apologetic words confirmed it. In rural Tennessee, resources for animal emergencies were limited at best, non-existent at worst. Sarah ended the call with a terse thank you, immediately dialing the county sheriff's department, where she was transferred twice before reaching a deputy who listened to her description of the situation with what sounded like genuine concern. "We can send someone out to document the abuse for prosecution purposes," he explained, "but honestly, our animal control officer is off until morning, and none of us have the training to handle a medical situation like what you're describing." "This dog won't survive until morning," Sarah said, watching as the animal's shivers became more pronounced, its breath coming in labored pants that created small clouds in the frigid air. "The temperature is going to drop into the single digits tonight. He's already critical, hypothermic, dehydrated, probably septic from the infected collar. I'm a nurse. I know dying when I see it." The deputy was silent for a moment, then offered the only solution within his power. He would call Dr. James Wilson, a retired veterinarian who sometimes assisted the department with animal cases. "No promises," the deputy cautioned. "Doc Wilson's pushing 80, and he lives about 40 minutes from your location. But if anyone will come out on a night like this for a dog in trouble, it's him." As Sarah waited, she returned to her car, bringing back the emergency blanket and her coat, sacrificing her own comfort for the dog's more urgent need. Approaching again with the same careful narration of her movements, she gently draped the blanket over the shivering animal, tucking it around without restricting access to the chain. "Help is coming," she promised, hoping she wasn't lying to those trusting eyes that continued to watch her every move. "Just hold on a little longer." The headlights appeared on the horizon nearly an hour later, an eternity during which Sarah had alternated between sitting beside the dog, sharing what warmth she could, and pacing to keep her own circulation going in the biting cold. She had offered small amounts of water at regular intervals, broken off tiny pieces of her sandwich for the dog to eat, and maintained a one-sided conversation in a voice grown hoarse from the cold air and emotional strain, anything to keep the animal engaged, to prevent it from slipping into the dangerous lethargy of hypothermia. Dr. Wilson proved to be a stooped figure, with a shock of white hair visible beneath a worn baseball cap, his movements slow but purposeful as he emerged from an ancient pickup truck carrying a battered leather medical bag. His face was a topography of wrinkles deepened by decades of sun exposure, but his eyes were sharp beneath bushy brows as he assessed the situation with a glance that missed nothing. "You did right to call," he said by way of greeting, his voice a gravelly drawl. "This boy's in a bad way." Sarah briefed the veterinarian with clinical efficiency, listing her observations of the dog's condition and the interventions she'd attempted, watching with growing respect as the elderly man knelt in the mud without hesitation, speaking to the dog in the same low, reassuring tone she had used. The animal responded differently to Dr. Wilson, however, a subtle shift in posture, a softening around the eyes that suggested recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who had dedicated his life to healing creatures like himself. "This collar's been on for months, maybe longer," Dr. Wilson said, his weathered hands gentle as they explored the damaged tissue around the dog's neck. And this chain's been his whole world for just as long. No shelter, minimal food from the look of him, about 40 pounds underweight for his frame. Golden Retriever mix, probably around 3 years old. Should be in his prime, not fighting for his life on a frozen patch of dirt. The plan Dr. Wilson proposed was risky, but necessary. They would sedate the dog where he lay, cut through the chain with the bolt cutters the veterinarian had brought, and transport him in the back of Dr. Wilson's truck to the vet's home surgery, a converted garage where he still treated animals despite his official retirement. The collar stays for now, he explained, drawing medication into a syringe. Removing it requires surgery in a proper setting. The tissue's grown around it in places, and we could do more harm than good trying to take it off here. Sarah held the dog's head gently as Dr. Wilson administered the sedative, whispering reassurances as the animal's eyes began to droop, his breathing slowing from the labored pants of earlier to a more regular rhythm. "You're safe now," she promised, meaning it this time, watching as the tension finally left the dog's body, muscles relaxing into what was likely the first peaceful rest he had experienced in months. "No one's going to hurt you ever again." The actual cutting of the chain was anticlimactic after the emotional intensity of the preceding hours. The bolt cutters made short work of a link far enough from the collar to leave room for attachment of a leash later. Dr. Wilson worked with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar rescues before, his arthritic hands sure in their movements, despite the cold that must have made his joints ache. "Good quality chain," he noted with a humorless laugh. "Too bad the owners didn't put the same effort into proper care." Together, they lifted the sedated dog onto the tarp Dr. Wilson had spread in the bed of his truck, wrapping him in additional blankets against the cold of the open vehicle. "I've got a heater going in the back," the veterinarian explained, securing the tarp with practiced movements. "And it's only 20 minutes to my place from here. He'll hold on. This boy's a fighter, or he wouldn't have made it this long." Sarah followed Dr. Wilson's truck in her own car, heater blasting, wiping periodically at tears that kept threatening to obscure her vision. The adrenaline that had carried her through the rescue was ebbing, leaving behind a hollow fatigue and an emotion she couldn't immediately identify. Something beyond sadness or anger, a profound disturbance at the capacity for cruelty that existed in a world she had dedicated her life to healing. Dr. Wilson's place turned out to be a modest farmhouse set back from the road, surrounded by oak trees that stood like silent sentinels against the night sky. The converted garage at the rear of the property glowed with welcoming light, and as they carried the still sedated dog inside, Sarah was surprised to find a fully equipped veterinary surgery that wouldn't have been out of place in a modern clinic, a stark contrast to the weathered exterior of the building. "People wonder why I keep all this going after retirement," Dr. Wilson said, noting her expression as they transferred the dog to an examination table. "Truth is, county needs it. Official vet clinics overworked, understaffed, and 30 miles from half the farms around here. Animals still get sick, still get hurt, still need someone who knows what they're doing, especially the ones nobody wants to pay for." He began gathering supplies with the methodical movements of someone who had performed similar procedures countless times, pausing only to wash his hands at a deep utility sink. The next hour passed in a blur of focused activity. Dr. Wilson working with quiet competence to clean wounds, start an IV line for fluids and antibiotics, check vital signs, and assess the full extent of the dog's injuries. Sarah assisted where she could, falling naturally into the role of surgical nurse, despite her unfamiliarity with veterinary procedures, handing instruments, monitoring the dog's breathing, and managing the IV flow with the precision her human patients received. "Right medical fundamentals apply to all mammals," Dr. Wilson observed, nodding approvingly at her technique. "Different anatomy, same principles. Body's trying to heal itself, just needs some help getting past the damage." His examination confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the collar. It had indeed grown into the dog's flesh in multiple places, creating wounds that would require careful surgical dissection to safely remove without damaging the jugular vein or carotid artery that pulsed dangerously close to the embedded metal. "Can you help with the surgery?" Dr. Wilson asked, looking at Sarah with an appraising gaze that recognized her medical competence. "Normally I'd call my daughter. She's a vet tech over in Nashville, but she can't make it out tonight with the roads icing up. This boy needs that collar off now. Waiting till morning means more tissue damage, increased infection risk, and prolonged suffering. It's not a complicated procedure, but I need an extra pair of hands, someone who won't faint at the sight of blood. Sarah's shift had ended 8 hours ago. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and facing another workday in less than 12 hours. But looking at the dog, sedated now but still fighting for each breath, his body depleted by months of neglect, the decision wasn't really a decision at all. "Just tell me what you need me to do," she said, already moving to scrub her hands more thoroughly at the sink, mentally cataloguing the surgical principles that would translate from human to canine patients. As Dr. Wilson prepared the surgical field around the dog's neck, administering additional anesthesia to ensure complete unconsciousness during the procedure, Sarah found herself talking to the animal again, a habit formed during those tense hours by the fence. "You've got the best chance now," she told him softly, stroking his flank where it wasn't covered by sterile drapes. "Dr. Wilson's going to remove that awful collar, and then you can start healing properly. You just need to keep fighting a little longer." The surgery lasted 3 hours, a delicate, painstaking process of separating metal from living tissue that had grown around it, of preserving blood vessels and nerves that had adapted to the presence of a foreign object now being removed. Dr. Wilson worked with the focus and precision that came from decades of practice, his arthritic hands steady when it mattered most, his instructions to Sarah clear and concise. Together, they freed the dog from the collar that had become both prison and torture device, revealing beneath it a raw ring of damaged tissue that told its own story of prolonged suffering. "He'll have scarring," Dr. Wilson said, applying antibiotic ointment to the wound before bandaging it with gentle pressure. "But dogs heal better than people in some ways, less concerned with appearances, more focused on function. The fur will cover most of it eventually." He stepped back, surveying their work with clinical satisfaction, the removed collar now sitting in a kidney dish like a grotesque artifact, crusted with blood and tissue that made its true nature as a simple pet accessory almost unrecognizable. Dawn was breaking by the time they finished the post-operative care, administering pain medication, adjusting the IV fluids, monitoring vital signs until they stabilized in a range that suggested the dog's remarkable resilience had carried him through yet another trauma. Outside the converted garage, the world was transformed by an overnight ice storm, trees encased in crystalline sheaths that fractured the morning light into prismatic patterns across the snow-covered ground. Sarah stood at the window, suddenly aware of her own exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that came from sustained emotional and physical exertion. "I've called him Lazarus," Dr. Wilson said from behind her, offering a mug of coffee that Sarah accepted gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "Seems fitting for a dog who's come back from the dead, so to speak." The name resonated with Sarah's own thoughts. There had been moments during the surgery when she feared they would lose him, when his depleted body seemed too damaged to withstand the additional stress of anesthesia and surgical intervention. But Lazarus had defied those fears, his vital signs stabilizing, his breathing settling into the deep, regular rhythm of healing sleep rather than the shallow pants of distress she had witnessed by the fence. Looking at him now, cleaned, bandaged, hooked to IV fluids delivering much-needed hydration and medication, it was possible to see glimpses of the dog he might become. The golden fur that would grow back thick and lustrous with proper nutrition, the muscular frame that would fill out once emaciation was replaced with health, the bright eyes that might one day reflect joy instead of fear. Dr. Wilson insisted that Sarah rest on his couch before attempting the drive home, a kindness she accepted without argument, her body making the decision for her as she sank into the worn cushions. "I'll wake you if there's any change," the veterinarian promised, already settling into a rocking chair positioned to monitor both Lazarus and the collection of medical equipment supporting his recovery. "Though I suspect our boy here is going to be just fine, given time and care." Sarah slept for 3 hours, waking to the sound of Dr. Wilson moving around the garage-turned-surgery, checking monitors and adjusting medications with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to working while others rested. Lazarus was awake too, his eyes tracking the veterinarian's movements with cautious awareness, still sedated enough to remain calm but conscious enough to process his radically changed circumstances. When he noticed Sarah watching, his tail thumped once against the blankets, a tentative gesture that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "He's doing remarkably well," Dr. Wilson said, noting her emotional response with the understanding of someone who had witnessed similar connections form countless times before. Temperatures normalizing, wounds look clean, blood work shows anemia and malnutrition as expected, but no sign of organ failure. He's young and he was healthy before this happened. Those factors are working in his favor now. The question of what came next hung unspoken between them as they monitored Lazarus through the morning, Dr. Wilson checking vital signs, changing bandages, administering medications, Sarah assisting where she could, her nursing training translating easily to this different but fundamentally similar context of healing. The county shelter was still the official destination for rescued animals, but they both knew the reality: overwhelmed with cases, understaffed, and limited in resources for a dog needing extensive rehabilitation. "I have a proposition," Dr. Wilson said finally, over sandwiches he had insisted on making for their belated lunch. "I'm getting too old for nighttime emergency calls and marathon surgeries. My daughter's been after me to move to Nashville, be closer to her kids, let someone younger handle the strays and the midnight rescues." He glanced at Lazarus, who had fallen back into healing sleep, front paw twitching slightly as he dreamed. "But I can't just walk away from cases like this, knowing there's no one else stepping up." Sarah listened as the veterinarian outlined his proposal. He would provide medical care for Lazarus during the initial recovery phase, leveraging his connections to obtain donated medications and supplies. The sheriff's department would document the case, pursue charges against the property owners if they could be identified, and officially release the dog for adoption once the investigation was complete. All that remained was the critical question of where Lazarus would live during his lengthy rehabilitation and beyond, a home that could accommodate his physical and psychological needs as he recovered from both external and internal wounds. "I've seen how you are with him," Dr. Wilson continued, his weathered face serious. "You've got the medical background to manage his care, the patience for rehabilitation, and something just as important, he trusts you already. That's rare with abuse cases, especially ones this severe. Usually takes months for them to even tolerate human contact without fear responses." He leaned forward, gaze direct. "Would you consider fostering him, at least through recovery, maybe longer if it's a good fit?" Sarah's reflexive response was practical rather than emotional. Her small apartment's no-pet policy, her long nursing shifts, the financial constraints of her recent divorce, the existing responsibility of her elderly cat. But even as these obstacles formed in her mind, she found herself looking at Lazarus, at the steady rise and fall of his chest that represented a triumph of resilience over cruelty, and knew that logistics were problems to solve rather than answers in themselves. "I'd need to make some arrangements," she said slowly, already mentally rearranging her life to accommodate this unexpected development. "Talk to my landlord, adjust my schedule at the hospital, figure out a system for when I'm working." She trailed off, realizing that she had already made the decision, had perhaps made it the moment she pulled over on that frozen road and refused to drive past suffering she could alleviate. Dr. Wilson's face creased in a smile that erased years from his appearance, transforming him from stern medical professional to co-conspirator in an unlikely rescue. "I figured you'd say that. Already called my friend at the Oak Ridge Apartments. She owns the building, sets the rules. Says she can make an exception for a medical therapy dog, which is what Lazarus will be, officially speaking. Papers are all ready for signing when you're ready." The following days established a new routine. Sarah driving to Dr. Wilson's after her shifts at the hospital, learning the specifics of canine wound care, medication management, and rehabilitation exercises. Lazarus improved steadily, his physical resilience matched by a psychological adaptability that amazed both his caretakers. Where they had expected prolonged fear, defensive aggression, or attachment disorders common in severely abused animals, they found instead a dog who approached each day as a new opportunity, each human interaction as a potential source of kindness rather than cruelty. "It's like he's made a conscious decision to trust again," Dr. T. Wilson observed a week after the surgery, watching as Lazarus approached Sarah without hesitation, leaning against her legs in a gesture of affection that had once seemed impossible. You see this sometimes in the worst cases, a resilience that goes beyond physical survival, a capacity for forgiveness that most humans couldn't manage. It's why I never gave up this work, even when it broke my heart most days. By the second week, Lazarus was strong enough to begin short walks around Dr. Wilson's property, his gait still unsteady from muscle weakness, but improving daily as proper nutrition and gentle exercise rebuilt what neglect had destroyed. Sarah found herself documenting his progress obsessively. Photos, videos, detailed notes on weight gain and wound healing, partly for Dr. Wilson's medical records, but mostly to reassure herself that this was real, that the transformation she was witnessing wasn't just wishful thinking. "Ready to take him home, Doctor?" Wilson asked at the end of the third week, reviewing the latest blood work that showed Lazarus's values approaching normal ranges. His weight increased by nearly 10 pounds of lean muscle, his coat beginning to regrow in the patchy areas where parasites and malnutrition had caused hair loss. He'll still need daily wound checks, medication twice a day and limited activity for another month at least, but he's stable enough for home care now. 1 year after that frozen January night, Sarah sat on a bench at Oak Ridge Community Park, watching as Lazarus raced along the shore of the small lake, golden coat gleaming in the winter sunlight, powerful legs carrying him with the joyful abandon of a dog who had reclaimed his birthright of freedom and movement. The scars around his neck were barely visible now, covered by thick fur and fading with each passing month. A physical healing that mirrored his psychological recovery, the past present, but no longer defining his existence. "Quite a difference," remarked Dr. Wilson, who had joined Sarah for their now traditional monthly walk, his own movements slower but still steady, despite the advancing arthritis that had finally convinced him to sell his practice and move to Nashville part-time. He watched Lazarus with undisguised pride, the satisfaction of a healer who had witnessed the full arc from near death to vibrant life. "Hard to believe he's the same dog we operated on that night." Indeed, the transformation was so complete that people who met Lazarus now saw only a friendly, well-adjusted golden retriever mix with an unusual attentiveness to human emotions. They couldn't imagine the skeletal, terrified creature chained to a frozen fence, couldn't see the months of careful rehabilitation behind each confident stride and trusting interaction. Only the occasional startle at unexpected movements, the slight wariness around men wearing certain types of work boots, betrayed the shadows of trauma that would never completely disappear. Sarah's own life had undergone a parallel transformation, changes catalyzed by that chance detour, and impulsive stop that had brought Lazarus into her world. Her apartment manager had not only approved the exception to the no-pet policy, but had been so moved by Lazarus's story that she'd offered Sarah a ground-floor unit with a small fenced yard, perfect for a recovering dog's modest exercise needs. Colleagues at the hospital had organized a donation drive for pet supplies and veterinary costs, support that evolved into a formal non-profit, providing emergency medical care for animals from low-income households. Most significantly, Sarah had found herself drawn more deeply into animal welfare work, volunteering with the county shelter on her days off, applying her medical expertise to cases that might otherwise have been deemed too damaged or difficult for rehabilitation. Her nursing career continued. She still worked full-time in the ICU, finding renewed purpose in her human patients, but she had discovered a secondary calling in the intersection of human and animal healing, a space where her skills found unexpected application. "The sheriff called yesterday," Dr. Wilson said, lowering himself carefully onto the bench beside Sarah, his joints stiff in the winter air despite the relatively mild temperature. "They finally closed the case on whoever chained Lazarus. Property owner claimed he'd rented the place to some people who skipped out, left no forwarding address. No way to prove who actually did it, but they've put the owner on notice about conditions on the property, condemned the old house." Sarah nodded, unsurprised by the lack of justice. Rural animal abuse cases rarely resulted in meaningful consequences, a reality that had fueled her advocacy for stronger laws and enforcement over the past year. But looking at Lazarus now splashing happily in the shallows of the lake, she found it difficult to maintain anger at nameless former owners when the dog himself had so thoroughly embraced his second chance, refusing to be defined by what had been done to him rather than what he had overcome. "Sometimes I think he's taught me more than I've taught him," Sarah admitted, watching as Lazarus abandoned his water play to greet a child who had approached with cautious curiosity. The dog's body language was a textbook display of gentle reassurance. Head lowered, movements slow, tail wagging at half-mast to appear less threatening. behaviors he had developed independently, his own response to sensing apprehension in others. About resilience, about forgiveness, about living in the present instead of dwelling on the past. Dr. Wilson chuckled, his breath forming a small cloud in the crisp air. That's the secret most pet owners eventually discover. We think we're saving them, but they're usually saving us right back, just in less obvious ways. He gestured towards Sarah's nursing scrubs, visible beneath her unzipped jacket. You still heading to that conference next month? The one on animal-assisted therapy in healthcare settings? Sarah nodded, excitement warming her voice despite the morning chill. Lazarus and I are actually presenting a case study, his journey from rescue to therapy dog, the protocols we developed for patient interactions, the outcomes we've documented with long-term ICU patients. She glanced at the certification badge attached to Lazarus's vest, abandoned on the bench during his lake adventure, official recognition of training that had formalized his natural empathy into structured therapeutic interactions. The conference represented a culmination of the unexpected path that had opened before Sarah, an opportunity to share what Lazarus had taught her about the healing power of connection across species boundaries. Her colleagues had been skeptical at first when she proposed bringing a dog into the sterile environment of the ICU, but the results had been undeniable, patients responding to Lazarus's gentle presence when human interventions failed, finding motivation for painful physical therapy exercises when rewarded with his attentive companionship, experiencing measurable reductions in stress hormones and blood pressure during his visits. Life takes such strange turns, Sarah mused, calling Lazarus back as she checked her watch, aware that her shift would begin in 2 hours. If that tree hadn't fallen across my usual route home, if I hadn't noticed that movement by the fence, she trailed off, unwilling to contemplate the alternative timeline where Lazarus had succumbed to exposure and starvation, where their paths had never crossed on that frozen January night. Lazarus returned at her call, shaking water from his coat in a spray of droplets that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds before settling beside the bench, leaning comfortably against Sarah's legs in a gesture that had become his signature expression of contentment. Dr. Wilson reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, receiving a gentle headbutt of appreciation against his palm. Some might call it coincidence, the veterinarian said. I prefer to think of it as being exactly where you needed to be, when someone else needed you most.